Okay, welcome to this talk, Impressionist Painting Techniques. And in this talk, we're going to look at a number of painting techniques employed by Impressionist painting, partly because it's very appropriate for student painters to become familiar with a range of ways of applying paint, but more importantly, a range of ways of applying colour. And Impressionist painting was essentially about creating colour with light. So I'm going to actually turn to the first slide now, and it's the most famous Impressionist painting of all, Impression Sunrise, painted by Claude Monet in about 1872. And the way to first talk about this painting is really in the way that it's actually painted, which is an Impressionist form. That's to say, the actual brush marks in this are creating an impression, and no more than an impression. It was criticized at the time by the critics as being basically just like a sketch, and it obviously has sketch-like qualities to it, but it is a finished painting, and it was presented as a finished painting at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874 in Paris. But the thing to say about this, I'm just going to describe a little bit about the actual techniques here. This was painted en plein air, that's to say, on the actual, in the actual harbour. Monet got up very early one morning and painted this on a canvas. And the first bits of painting he did were really like these kind of orangey sort of cloud forms here, because what he did was he actually covered quite a large part of the canvas initially, and it was a white canvas. All Impressionist painting is done on a white ground, and he covered this with this very loose brushwork, and it was very heavily, this orangey ochre colour was very heavily diluted with terps, because he was using oil paint. I know we use acrylic, but it's the same principle. We would dilute it with water, and you can see almost the rapidity of the brushwork here. It's very loosely, sketchily, sort of ethereally, yeah, just brushed in, and a lot of the paint was probably running down the canvas a bit. Now, whilst that was still wet, he then goes to sort of block in these larger, almost silhouette forms. And that's why it gives it that lovely kind of, it's blending. You can see how the blues are blending into this underpainting of the orangey ochre. And you can do the same with acrylics. You just have to keep your acrylic paint wet. It's essentially a wet into wet painting technique. And all this colour, the underpainting colour, was distributed down here as well. You can see bits of it here and here and here. And then gradually he starts to move into the mauves. So this cobalt blue that he's using for the kind of horizon, he adds some alizarin red to it, and then you start to get into these mauves. He's adding white into this mixture as well. And I think someone's got their microphone on. If you could just turn off your microphone, and gradually he's moving down the canvas. And so this is again what some of the blues have had lots of white added to it. It's quite a sort of cerulean blue here in this lighter area. And we then come to the top layer of paint, where the paint is still wet, but he's actually applying much thicker colour in these areas where the boatman is, and the reflection of the boat, and here, and the sun, the orange sun, and the orange reflection, and these sort of shadows of the water. They're impasto, well, they're thick paint, brushed in. very rapidly into this wet paint. So that's in introduction, that's a short précis of a typical Impressionist painting. And I just want to turn it to the next slide. The Impressionist, the most salient Impressionist painting techniques were that the Impressionists used thick strokes of paint to capture the essence of the object, and they were painting appearances, the appearances of light, rather than the actual objects themselves. Quickly applied brush strokes give this a sense of atmosphere, movement, and spontaneity. The thick impasto application means that even reflections on the water's surface appear as substantial as any object in a scene. The Impressionists lightened their palette, and generally the palettes of Impressionist paintings, they're fairly kind of light in colour. They don't go for these very deep dark browns by and large. Most importantly of all, complementary colours are being used. That's to say, they place the complementaries of red. Red is the complementary of green, blue is the complementary of orange, and yellow is the complementary of violet. They were placed against one another, side by side, and the eye does the optical mixing. Wet into wet painting techniques, and it's a la prima. That's to say, the Impressionist paintings were generally made with one touch painting. It wasn't like a build-up of layers as you get in old master or classical painting. They used optical mixing rather than mixing on the palette, which I've been saying. The colours were placed either next to one another or on top of one another. So you get a kind of colour vibration when that happens, and placing like a red next to a green in our eye, that kind of like mixes and we get this sort of specific colour sensation. The red appears more powerful and the green appears more powerful because they've been placed next to one another, because they're complementary colours. Broken colour refers to the effect of blending colours optically rather than on the palette. So these individual brushstrokes placed next to one another create this optical flicker on our retinas. And that's basically the basis of Impressionist painting. But in the next slide, I just want to go back to the time just immediately before Impressionism. We can look at a few paintings by Monet, because this is just before the Impressionist technique proper, where you can see there are still many of the ingredients for Impressionist in this painting. He's painting out in the open air. He's actually made this painting on a beach, and it's wet into wet painting. It's painted very quickly and spontaneously, again on a white canvas. And the reason we paint on a white canvas in Impressionist painting is because it throws back the maximum amount of luminosity, because what's happening is light hits the canvas, it travels through the layers of paint, hits the surface of the canvas, which is primed white, and then because it's primed white, it throws back the extra brilliance of those colours, because they've got basically a white ground that's illuminating the colours. It's almost, if you can imagine, like looking at a stained glass window with the white light behind it, and it increases the colour luminosity of the colours. And so this is painted in the 1860s, about a decade before Impressionism. But you can see he's sort of like using wet into wet painting techniques. So the shadow of the lady here, he's basically painted the face, the illuminated part of the face, and whilst all over, and then whilst that's still wet, he's taken just a touch of that blue that is quickly sketched in for the shadow of the umbrella, and just mixed it with the underpainting there, and created this sort of coolish shadow, this coolish brown shadow, and we read it as a kind of shadow on the woman's face. You can see these lovely, I mean, very sketchy, like the hat there. You can actually see the individual brush strokes, and whilst that's still wet, is just tipping in very quickly the darker parts of the hat. The head here laid in one tone, and then whilst that's still wet, just a little bit of cadmium red, still wet, blended into that tone. And because the paint's wet, it creates a softness, so you avoid hard edges. You avoid hard edges with the differentiation of, say, shadow to light. You see, likewise here, and it's filled with a great sense of light. I mean, lots of white is being brushed into the sky, with just hints of blue and bluey grey into it. Likewise with the beach, it's throwing back a lot of light. So this was how Impressionism started. And if we go to a painting, La Grenouille, which was made just a short while later, La Grenouille is a place on the Seine where young fashionable couples would go to. Monet and Renoir go out there one day and make these on-the-spot paintings of the scene. And the interesting thing to see about the development of the technique, painting technique, is he's now actually beginning to break up more brush marks. Individual marks of colour are being placed next to one another, as you can see here, like these cold blues to the warmer yellowy blues to that kind of lilac there. And if we look up here, the way light's falling on the trees here, this is a myriad of individual brush marks, the sort of yellowy green against the darker, cooler green. So warm colours against cool colours, individual brush strokes, and it's creating an optical flicker. It's animating the surface of the painting. Some wet into wet painting with women's dresses, some underpainting of sort of like this sort of brownish colour, grey underneath. Then whilst that's still wet, going in with a kind of cerulean blue. And what it's doing is it's avoiding these harsh lines. It's creating the kind of flickering, lively, animated surface that we get when we're out in the open air. There's a great deal of life to optical vision. There's we never see things as a sort of static, abstract image. Our eyes are always moving around, and there's this optical flicker, and it's especially so in the water. And again, individual brush strokes of, like, in the shadow areas, these just individual brush strokes of like olive green. The bathers need no more than just a dab of like this light khaki, a separate dab of sort of deeper brown for the hair. And then the way the light is, this crystalline light on the water, it's dazzling. So individual just brush strokes of white, individual brush strokes of blue, light blue, the kind of grey brown of the bather there, again a brush stroke, a light blue under it, and then the reflection, the brown, and then the blue under it. The bathers here in their costumes, underpainted with a sort of warmish grey brown, and then tipped in very quickly with the sort of Prussian grey blue, and these are very quick individual brush strokes. And what it's doing is it's the same color here in the dark shadow. That kind of blue is the same color as that, and it's setting up very quickly the kind of appearances that they were recording, because people in the scene in front of them were moving around, so they had to capture it very quickly. And these individual brush strokes of color were a very quick way of capturing it. A lot of underpainting went in just to begin with, as you saw with the first painting of Impression Sunrise. A lot of this would have been quickly blocked in with very loosely diluted paint, and then these thicker layers of paint would have been added at a later stage. So I just want to move on to just a little bit of the painting we're going to look at next, which is the Gare Lazare station by Monet. And this technical bulletin from the National Gallery says Monet's Gare Lazare are in some ways classic examples of Impressionist execution. The paint is applied wet into wet on a pure white or off-white ground, that's the ground of the canvas, the white canvas ground, with some mixing of paint on the canvas. In both paintings, the light-coloured ground is used as a device to intensify the overall luminosity of the scene. That's what I was saying about white light bouncing back. While Renoir employs superimposed strokes of intense pure colour, often containing only a single pigment or tint, Monet's paints are complicated mixtures of disparate pigments. So we're going to just look at, Monet tended to mix his colours more on the canvas than on the palette. And so here's one of the Garcon Lazar paintings. And I mean, here you can actually see the white canvas still peeking through. So you can see he's quickly blocking in the large areas of shadow, and there he's leaving the white canvas where smoke is. He's left that white and then he's overpainted it with the kind of the lilac blue smoke. And again, the lilacs again painted very thinly on this sort of canvas, white, off-white canvas ground. And then the more worked areas of the actual trains. We're going to look at a detail of those worked areas, but look at the lovely kind of the warmth of these browns and dark blues against these sort of much cooler air-filled expanses of smoke and light. Just individual strokes of blues and whites, ceruleans, just add up to this very atmospheric scene. Here's the actual close-up, and you can see how he's actually mixing the paints on the surface. So like these dark blues, and then whilst that dark blue brown is still wet, he's literally striking through that colour with some white and cerulean, just to give that kind of gleam that you get on metallic, of like gunmetal, you know, these metallic reflections on surfaces. The khaki quickly brushed in for the platform, and then just literally just a kind of a blizzard of brush strokes, dark browns, dark blues, some orangey reds, just quickly sketched in one touch, alla prima brushwork, but it's giving this sense of life and animation and incident to the canvas. You just get this sense of people moving on a platform, partly being obscured by smoke and the general atmosphere of the scene. Here's just another example. It's a bit of a poor slide, but another example of just how quickly he was able to get down this sense of life and movement by individual brushstrokes applied very, very rapidly. So I'm going to move on now to a later example of Monet's paintings, and this is late Monet, and this painting is actually in the National Gallery, and it's water lilies. This is a detail of them, but his painting technique has gone on to develop a much more kind of distilled, concentrated surface. He's still creating light and he's still putting colours next to one another, but he's also building up layers of colour so that the colour underneath is sort of filtering through. So like in areas like these sort of tawny, smoky, yellowy browns down here, you can actually see the kind of the underpainting of the warm lilacs underneath that. And the paintings in his later paintings, especially in the Water Lilies series, they actually become, if you go close up to them, they're actually really almost crust-like. You see, like that area there, that's where this lighter yellowy lemon has been literally just brushed on whilst the underpaint is dry. So the painting was started, as in the first Impressionist sunrise painting we looked at, very loosely, very washily diluted paint. But then he goes on to build up further layers. Again, using the techniques of colours one against another, so lilacs next to yellows, and they're complementaries. And then he starts to build up this surface. And rather than, as in the earlier Garcon Lazar paintings, where he's basically putting colours next to one another, in the later paintings, he's not only putting colours next to one another, but he's also putting colours on top of one another. So you get this interaction of colours, how they interact above one another. So, and it builds up this sort of intense, almost like a sort of fabric, a weave of fabric under one another, over one another. And here the paint is being allowed to dry underneath. So like the lilacs and the colder colours have been allowed to dry. And then he's gone over it with literally an impasto brushstroke of yellow, because you can see how it's breaking up there, which indicates that it's painted on a dry surface. And likewise here, these are all impasto, and this is the final layer of paint that he would have put on. These sort of, this very quick calligraphic brushwork with the paint, impasto paint, painted on a dry surface. And here, this sort of tawny, sort of smoky yellow, that's scumbling, where you put the paint on with a dry brush, and the paint underneath is dry, and it allows this sort of smoky quality, because you're getting some of the undercolor showing through in the overpainting, and it allows artists to create a very atmospheric, smoky, misty scene. Now we're going to look at Monet's contemporary Renoir. Again, they both went out to Asnieres on the River Seine, and this is a classic Renoir. We're going to look at how the techniques of this painting were made. And in Renoir's case, it really is a case of literally broken brushstrokes placed next to one another. So we're going to look at details of this. But before we do so, I just want to show you these individual brushstrokes of blue. Again, you can actually see the canvas down the edges there. That's the white canvas, or off-white canvas, that they used to paint on. So it would have been, like Monet, quickly brushed in with diluted paint, first of all, just to establish the main forms, the horizon there, the house and so on, the skiff, the boat. That would have been painted in really quite rapidly at first. And then, you know, Renoir would have started painting the kind of the blues, these beautiful blues. And he's not just using one blue, he's using a myriad of like ultramarine blues, cobalt blues. There's some hint of cerulean blue here. And it's sort of building up this lovely kind of mosaic of color interactions, and he's juxtaposing with warmer colors, so individual brushstrokes of warmer oranges and greens, and he's distributing these colors around the painting. So if he puts blues down here, he puts blues up here. If he puts greens up here, he puts greens down here. So it's uniting the surface. It's creating a luminous envelope in which the color sits. We're going to look at just a detail of the painting, and this beautiful sort of interweaving of color, these wonderful brush strokes, all wet, you know, the paint is still wet, applied very rapidly. With the women's dresses, this is wet into wet painting. White has been laid down, and then whilst the white is wet, these sort of shadow areas of yellows and blues and red to create that greeny shadow is brushed into the white, create a very luminous shadow of these complementary colours. Likewise with the blues going into the whites, the pinks, the warmish pinks going into the white, just the yellows there, just quickly brushed in. They give this sense of sort of movement and of life to the actual painting. Again, individual brush strokes in this slide. Yellowy green paint applied over it, but also it's been scumbled here, and also perhaps there's some underpainting where it's been allowed to just run down the canvas a bit. It looks like here the paint has run a bit, so it's, you know, the brush strokes being applied, they're wet, and the paint's running a bit. But you know, he's juxtaposing these warm strokes of yellowy green against the colder blues, and then the sparkling light, just individual brush strokes. Whilst you see the paint still wet there, the white goes into the blue, and you get this wonderful sense of impasto colour. So we're now moving on to another Impressionist, Paul Cezanne, and Cezanne's technique is somewhat different. Cezanne is an Impressionist, but his sense of Impressionism, he's still using the same techniques of using patches of colour to actually create a sense of optical vibration. But in Cezanne's painting, his paintings are much more concentrated on the idea of creating a structure out of what he called his sensations. So like Monet and Renoir, Cezanne is going out into the landscape with white canvases, and he's painting what he sees in front of him, okay? And he's painting the sensations that fall on his retina, like Monet does, and like Renoir does. So, you know, he's receiving his sense of light and colour in the same way that Renoir does, and in the same way that Monet does. However, what Cezanne is doing is he's giving a greater sense of order to those sensations, so that whereas Monet and Renoir literally do paint what is falling on their retina, with Cezanne there's also a kind of there's a mental override as well, so that Cezanne's brain is also telling him to structure these sensations. And so what happens as a result of that is that we get this sort of greater sense of structure and form, which accompanies his optical sensations. So he's not just processing optical images, he is organizing them. And so, for example, if we look at a detail of this landscape in Provence, he's obviously seeing the way light is falling on these trees, like here, but he's organizing that so that, like Monet and Renoir, he's placing coloured brushstrokes next to one another, so the warmer yellows go against the cooler greens. But what he's doing is, and this is something that kind of Monet and Renoir don't do quite so much. It's there with them, but it's not there to quite this degree. Cezanne is actually creating form. He's actually creating form and volume by the way he's placing colours next to one another. And that's a sense of structure. So if we look at this collection of trees and bushes here, do you see the way that, you know, we get this sense of roundness? So this tree, this bush, there's a roundness to it, and he's created that by putting the lighter yellow strokes here, and then he's juxtaposed those with the cooler, darker green strokes here, so that like he's creating shadow here, the illuminated part of the bush or tree there. And so we get a sense of volume, light into shadow, shadow into light. And then it comes to he sets up this relationship between this tree being in front of that tree. And how does he do it? By placing a cooler, bluey green shadow against the illuminated light of the tree there. So that creates a kind of shadow as the form is turning into the shadow area. And then as the form turns towards the light, we get this lighter green and the lighter yellows here. So we get a sense of the way light is falling on this form, and it's creating a sense of volume, literally by the way he's placing colours against one another there, and the volume there, the way he's placing colours next to one another there, and it goes into the deep shadow here. So he's taking the greens into the blue greens here. But then he's also giving us something more, because he's with the same technique of placing literally colours next to one another. He's pushing back the landscape in the background miles and miles and miles. So he's setting up these warm yellow tones for the hillside that's probably 2 or 3 miles back here. And then you get this kind of atmospheric blue there. And then this sort of the deep greens of this tree that is more in the foreground against the kind of the sandy yellows of the buildings in the background. And of course, what do we notice? The tones, the tonal values are greater with the trees in the foreground than the tonal values of these washed out greens and yellows in the background. So he's setting up these spatial values. Moreover, he's also setting up structures. So he doesn't outline things. He doesn't, if you put a line around all those forms, an unbroken line, that would abstract it. That's what the painter Gauguin did. Gauguin created a synthetic, almost a decorative surface. Cezanne doesn't do that. I mean, he said there are no outlines in nature. You don't look at a tree and see a blue outline. Now, having said that, there are outlines in Cezanne, you know, but they're not unbroken. What he's doing is he's creating these emphasis marks of blue, just the blue strokes there, just to emphasize the structure of that tree. And he's likewise doing it with the rocks. He's emphasizing the structure of those rocks. But you know, they are just really there to give a sense of structure. The main structure of the painting comes from the way colors, complementary colors, are placed against one another. And so in conclusion, the lesson that I want you to take from this lecture is really the business of placing individual colors against one another. And it's an important lesson to learn in understanding Impressionist techniques in painting. And with that, I'm going to finish this talk on Impressionist techniques in painting. And a lesson will follow on from this, which I will send you out later in the week. But I just want to finish by just resting our eyes